UFC's chief thug, Dana White, was caught on video beating his wife in a club. But this story hasn't gotten the wall-to-wall coverage that the white media consistently gives to black men who are falsely accused of misconduct. Now, as media has been leading the charge to show the hypocrisy, some of these white media writers have been forced to try to get the heat off of themselves by admitting to what we've known all along. So the white media is admitting that when it comes to black people who are falsely accused without a shred of evidence, they will intentionally write inflammatory stories meant to turn the public against that black person. But when they have a case where there's a white celebrity or white public figure like Dana White who's caught on video beating his wife in public, these white media bosses tell their writers, don't write anything inflammatory about this. So now we know what the rules are, and it's based on race. And all of these white media writers, they get the message. You don't have to say don't talk about it at all. They already understand. Don't write anything inflammatory means don't write anything at all. And you know that's the message because we see that's what they're trying to treat this story like, a non-event. This is an admission that there is a clear, open, declared, hands-off policy inside these white media companies when it comes to who they go in on and who they don't. And what determines the difference is race and nothing else. How many of these white media reporters do you see calling this out? How many of them will go on the record and name names and tell us who it is who's instructed them not to write anything that's so much as unflattering about Dana White? You got to have a hands-off policy. Who is it who set it up? Who's enforcing it? Who's calling the shots? Up until last week, the white media has reported on the UFC breathlessly. It's a billion-dollar company after all, and they're the fastest-growing combat sports company on earth. To hear the white media tell it. So, the biggest name in combat sports, a billion-dollar industry, and the white media has decided it doesn't matter. They're not going to talk about it, at least not right now. The entire justification for attacking every black male since the beginning of time is that they have power. And whenever that lie doesn't fit the narrative, then they say, well, this guy, he's bringing ill repute on a billion-dollar industry, don't you know? Just the very fact that he's employed in a big billion-dollar industry, well, that's the reason why if there's even the slightest accusation against him, we got to destroy him immediately. No due process. In fact, we're not even going to care whether or not the accusations are true or false, mainly because the white media is the one who made them. And the white media is going to cheer on these sports leagues run by such racists as Jerry Jones as they destroy and demonize a black man in public. This is a public lynching that you see when this stuff happens. Because after all, these are billion-dollar companies run by white supremacists. And because of that, well, they're just protecting themselves. Yeah, protecting themselves against all these big bad black men. They're not protecting themselves against the accusations. They're protecting themselves against these black men. They have a duty to not just publicly disagree with a black athlete. They have a duty to suspend him without pay, to put some onerous fine on him, to demand that he apologize to anyone who's ever lived multiple times, that he be talked to as if he was a child and not a grown man, give attention to any two-bit punk like Ari Emanuel who wants to assail them in the media because this black man works for a big company. So that's what needs to be done. That's what should be done. And the public just needs to understand that. Well, if Kyrie Irving was worth all that phony outrage because he posted a link to a product on Amazon, then all hell should be breaking loose right now when the man who runs the biggest MMA promotion on the planet, which rakes in billions of dollars per year and is owned by the most infamous talent agent on earth, beats his wife in public and is caught on video doing it. We ought to be having wall-to-wall. There ought to be an army of reporters camped outside of Ari Emanuel's and Dana White's homes. He ought to be getting the Ray Rice treatment times 10. Dana White and Ari Emanuel should be the topic du jour on all of the sports shows and on these entertainment tabloid shows. You got video of Dana White beating his wife. For God's sake, that ought to be leading all of these networks. I mean, that ought to be sensational, shouldn't it? Instead, it's a matter of, oh, he's the wrong color. We're going to bury this. Doesn't fit the narrative. Now, Dana White says, as has been stated before, mostly by the black media, the UFC is not owned by Dana White. It's actually owned by Endeavor, the company that was founded and is run by the infamous Ari Emanuel, who is basically Harvey Weinstein without the baggage. But what he lacks in sexual predation, he more than makes up for in shady business partners. And not only is the white media not making any big deal out of the most notorious talent agent ever, and how he hasn't even acknowledged that his buddy and business associate has been caught on video beating his wife, not only has Ari Emanuel not removed Dana White, but the white media is now openly speculating on whether Endeavor can handle owning both the UFC and Vince McMahon's WWE. Wife beater? What wife beater? Look at how awkward this is. They're just blatantly saying that they're going to ignore the elephant in the room, even while he's trampling people. We're moving on, buddy. Far as we're concerned, nothing to see here, buddy. What, the guy who runs one of Ari Emanuel's subsidiaries is beating his wife? Well, that's separate from Ari Emanuel, buddy. We're not going to put him on the hot seat about that, buddy. If he doesn't want to talk about it, we're not going to ask about it, buddy. It's not our job to put non-black people on the spot, buddy. The white media isn't calling out Dana White or Ari Emanuel. At least they want to see how long they can get away with it, whether or not this is going to sink under the same old, well, the public's heard him, we're going to move on because the white media says they're not talking about it. They had Ari Emanuel's racist, hypocritical, crooked smiling face plastered wall to wall when he was attacking Kanye West. Oh, they just couldn't get enough of him, and he couldn't get enough talking to them. They treated him like the single most important person in media. But now that one of his buddies, one of his subsidiaries, is in the news for negative reasons, he's gone into hiding. And they're not chasing him. The little weasel who had so much to say about Kanye West and Kyrie Irving and Dave Chappelle's words has absolutely nothing to say about his buddy Dana White's actions. We've seen very little coverage of Dana White's attack on his wife. And we've seen practically none about Ari Emanuel. The white media suddenly gone on radio silence about both of them. The white media, Ari Emanuel was posting his phony outrage pieces against Kanye West and Dave Chappelle and others. He also made a blink and you'll miss it mention of Donald Trump. He had to do that. That was a purely CYA maneuver, because everybody knew how tight he and Trump were. So if you're going to be sitting here complaining about anti-Semitism, how the hell are you not going to mention Donald Trump? You're talking about race. Remember that most people don't know is when Ari Emanuel was seen shaking hands with Donald Trump, there was a reason why he was meeting with Trump. Ari Emanuel was being vetted to be part of the Trump administration. Now, Donald Trump's racism is the stuff of legend. It's been known for 40 plus years now. Ari Emanuel can't lie and say he hadn't heard the rumors. He knew all about it. Oh, but what's different, though, is he wants to make hay about some black person that he wants to bring in and flog publicly. So if you're going to talk about Ari Emanuel and Donald Trump, let's not forget he wanted to be part of the Trump administration, even after everything he knew about Trump. In spite of all that, well, take a look at where Ari Emanuel's brother Rahm Emanuel is right now, ambassador to Japan. Now, there are certain countries who the United States basically makes it where you got to have some real influence and probably put up some money, too, if you want to be an ambassador to them. Great Britain, Japan, Germany, those are the kind of countries that the United States makes it where you can't just have any old person show up. You ain't got to be able to speak the language, but you do got to cross people's palms with some green. You got to have some stroke if you want to get one of those jobs. And Rahm Emanuel, the fact that he's in Japan, do you truly believe that if Donald Trump had been willing to make Ari Emanuel or Rahm Emanuel ambassador to Japan or Great Britain during his administration, you think either one of those two snakes in the grass would have turned it down? No. They were both in D.C. trying to figure out how do we get this international hustle on. That's what they were there to do. So we see exactly what Ari Emanuel's principles are. And this is the guy who wants to play moral paragon, as he calls himself, standing in judgment of black men. This is the guy who's going to be doing it. And nobody in the white media is going to be talking about this. They know all of this about Ari Emanuel and his brother. White power has to protect its operatives, after all. Now, a month knows how to skillfully manufacture and push a narrative when they want to. For instance, when they're targeting a black man to be destroyed, the very first thing they do is to talk to any sort of business associates, any companies that do business with him, hell, even nonprofits that he does any sort of charity or volunteer work for, anyone who has any connection to him at all. The white media talks to them and says, hey, look at this. We think that we got something on this guy. What do you say? Are you going to associate with him? Do you stand with him? Do you stand by him? They try to put anyone who they know on the hot seat to see if they can get any of them to crack. When that business or nonprofit says, oh, well, we got to step back from such and such, or we want to distance ourselves from him because the white media is demonizing him, then we're off to the races. Next, the white media tries to find anyone else who they can. All they need is like 2, maybe 3. After that, they can make a headline out of it saying so-and-so person, business or group who was dealing with Kanye or Ray Rice or whomever has announced that they're cutting ties over these allegations of fill in the blank. Now, it doesn't matter who the white media is propping up in front of the camera and claiming this is one of this guy's friends or business associates who's distancing themselves. It can be some bum on a street corner. It doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is to make the headline. They only need 2 or 3 people that they can point to before they can claim multiple groups are trying to distance themselves from this or that black man who they're attacking. This is a form of self-justification. This is self-validation that the white media does, and they're very skilled at it. It's completely false, but the damage it does is real. And this is done as a form of societal manipulation. They plaster that headline all over the place just to see who will fall next, who's going to go along with it next, try to get something going. The white media has the ability to manufacture a feeding frenzy or to manufacture the illusion that there's some groundswell of opposition to this or that black person when in reality it's just white media spin. They know that what they're saying are lies, but they also know that there's no formal organization or person who's got the power to hold them accountable as a group. The so-called news is whatever the white media decides it is, but mostly what it is a non-stop anti-black racist narrative. And because the black says that he's been married for 30 years, and here's something I want to know. Does anyone seriously believe that after 3 decades, this is the very first time that he's gone ham on her? Does anyone believe that in 3 decades, this is the first time this has happened? You saw the video. Did Dana White seem shocked or stunned at all? Did he seem like, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening? Hell no. He started swinging on her like, okay, this is just another day at the office. No surprise, no shock, not even hesitation. What the white media ought to be asking is this the very first time that Dana White has treated a woman like this? Because if Dana White was black, that's exactly what they would be asking. You would have DAs from New York to LA to wherever holding press conferences asking any women who Dana White has ever had contact with if they would step forward. His wife should be lambasted for standing by a woman beater. That's what happened with Ray Rice. Lies told about Bill Cosby, and they attacked Camille Cosby as if she shot the president. They should be saying that Dana White's apology is ridiculous, and they should be dismissing it as pathetic. Just an attempt to get people to overlook the fact that he beats his wife. That's what they do with black men, but all of a sudden the rules are different, because Dana White isn't black. And before we go any farther, I know that there are those who say that the black media should be blasting this wall to wall, and we are. We're going to go ahead and make sure that Dana White gets that business. But family, make sure that you're giving these scumbags the business wherever you are, whether it's a comment section, a chat room, or what have you. It's up to the grassroots to make sure that this does not die, just like we did with Harvey Weinstein. We ain't letting this go away. And that way, whenever these good white media companies do their little sports segments, next time they decide that they're going to be bringing some black man in for some abuse, very first thing that ought to be said is, what about Dana White? All of this, there's going to be one standard for black people and no standard for the Dana Whites and others. That's over. That's not going to be allowed. And that's what needs to be said. Because Ari Emanuel doesn't even have the decency, if it can be called that, to put Dana White on indefinite leave and say, oh, you got to step back for a while. They're not doing anything. See, these are the depths that the white media and its enablers stoop to. You have the cable bootlicks like Stephen Smith breaking out the sad violins and making it clear he's not going to cast any aspersions on his pal Dana. So the people who are in front of these cameras at these white media outlets have to be best buds with the very sports managers and white sports figures who they report on. But what about the black ones? Well, you can say anything you want about them. But when it comes to a Dana White or what have you, you better be very careful what you say. And you better not be going over the top. Nothing inflammatory. We're not trying to inflame people. We're trying to subdue them and get them to calm down and get them to dismiss this. This proves that the constant bad news and negative stories that we see about black athletes isn't because that's the most important news story of the day. Hell, it's not even because that's what the white media thinks. It's not because these black athletes did anything wrong. It's because you have a white media operating with an open racial bias. The people who run these white media outlets tell their subordinates who they're allowed to write anything about and who they're not. And if it's someone who looks like Dana White, you're not allowed to write anything about him that might put him in a negative light, even if he's beating his wife in public. No feeding frenzy allowed. We don't want the public to be conditioned to think that's what's supposed to happen. That's only something that happens with black men. You do that with them. You don't do that with anybody else. You won't be seeing Robin Roberts or Gail Skank or anybody else wailing and complaining about how terrible it is. All of these white liberals that you see, alleged liberals, none of them are going to be complaining and lamenting how bad it is that companies still sponsor and advertise with the UFC after what Dana White did. You're not going to be seeing the Huffington Post or anybody else running wall-to-wall pieces saying, oh my God, can you believe these big corporations are still propping these guys up? This is a man who beat his wife on camera. I can't believe they're still doing business with him. Why won't they just walk away? What's wrong with them? Oh, I guess they must support this. I guess they must approve. When Dana White gets back in front of the cameras, no one's going to be talking about how terrible it is that he's back in front of the cameras as if he hadn't done anything wrong and how the UFC is a disgrace. You won't be seeing any politicians in any of these states where the UFC is licensed to compete, any of these legislators or any of these prosecutors. None of them is going to be saying that there needs to be an investigation of Dana White or the UFC, or that there need to be some sort of legislative penalties leveraged by the government because of his behavior. See, you had a lot of talk about the steroid scandal in Major League Baseball, but everybody understood that that was mostly a black issue. It's because they were pointing at Barry Bonds. They were, look at him. They didn't pull that with Mark McGwire. With Mark McGwire, he's treated as a baseball hero. Barry Bonds, on the other hand, well, he's just an example of how cheaters can prosper because he's black. And by the way, if Ari Emanuel ever slithers out of whatever hole he's currently hiding in, nobody's going to confront him about when he intends to resign from Endeavor. Nobody's going to press him on when does he intend to finally get rid of Dana White. That's not going to be considered some sort of prerequisite for him to remain at Endeavor. This won't be treated as the enormous scandal that it is because white power won't allow it to be. That's the point they want to reinforce. Black people are apparently the bad guys in the society, and even if they haven't done anything wrong, well, they should be under scrutiny because, well, they're black. Meanwhile, Dana White can beat his wife in public, and Ari Emanuel can go from saying that people can't remain silent when offensive words are spoken to being silent himself after his friend and business partner beats his wife. Under white supremacy, this is what qualifies as media. And now you see why so many people have been whining the last few years after black athletes took a stand with those protests. These white supremacists in the society understand exactly what sports is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a place where black men come to perform for their amusement and to be publicly flogged, abused, and destroyed on bogus grounds, also for their amusement. If black men aren't running, jumping, or being forced to apologize, then these racists don't want to see them. Black athletes are supposed to be the designated whipping boy. That's what an athlete is supposed to be. Nobody ever decides to make some sort of media scandal out of how much money a white athlete makes, and certainly nobody like a Dana White or an Ari Emanuel. But when you got somebody like LeBron James, when he first joined the NBA, all the talk was about, well, how is it that this guy making all this money? He's 17 years old. Can he handle that? Nobody ever talks about white teenagers who get paid millions of dollars and asking if they can handle it. Even though in most of these cases, whether it's Britney Spears or whomever, we see that when they get their hands on this money, it destroys them. But it's a matter of this black athlete over here, we get to scrutinize and we get to use him as a proxy for the black community. You have money. Did you earn it, nigger? Did you steal it? Yeah, well, oh my God, he's being overpaid. Nobody ever says that about some white athlete. No white athlete has ever been called overpaid. Everybody understands that under white supremacy, this is the purpose that so-called sports reporting serves. It's meant to be a place where you can go ahead and legally make all these anti-black remarks and do it under the guise of, oh, I'm just talking about this athlete over here, and I'm not talking about him because of his race, I'm talking about him because he's a nigger who makes a lot of money. That's why when a black man earns a sports contract through his hard work and superior skills, you see these white supremacists online and in print and on TV saying, well, they ought to be grateful that we gave them the privilege to have somebody. They're very privileged. They need to be grateful. You know, these niggers should be thankful. The team owner isn't the one who needs to be thankful, and the fans certainly don't need to be thankful that their sports team has been saved. It's the black athletes. They're the ones who are supposed to be thankful. You get a sports contract as a black man, you're also supposed to take abuse too, if you're black. And by the way, it also extends to black women as well. The white media and a whole lot of those so-called spectators, they made a cottage industry out of persecuting, harassing, and racially assailing Venus and especially Serena Williams. They did everything they could to make it very clear. Even other athletes in tennis made it very clear that if these black women are going to be beating the brakes off of them on the court, setting all of these records and making it where nobody's going to remember the rest of them, well, they're going to tell these black women what they think about them. And the white media is saying, well, that's just the way it is. It's always kind of been a little rambunctious in tennis. Tennis has always been like that. That's what they said about tennis. Trying to defend anti-black racist behavior, just this over-the-top, blatant displays of anti-black racism against Serena Williams and Venus Williams, and the white media trying to pretend as if, oh, well, don't you know that tennis has always basically had the same atmosphere as, say, boxing crowds? That's how they try to treat it. Talking about tennis, this is the kind of deflection and dodge they try to use. Well, let's set the record straight, family. Without black athletes, there would be no NFL or NBA. Nobody would give a damn about golf or tennis if it wasn't for Tiger Woods or Serena Williams. Full stop. And as for the NBA, without black men, it would be like the European League or the WNBA. But what it wouldn't be is a world-spanning billion-dollar juggernaut. Black men were the ones who made that possible. Dana White is a violent thug, and the white media are enablers and protectors of women beaters. It's not enough to post a one-and-done tweet. Dana White has endangered $1 billion business, so anyone who's ever spent a dime with the UFC, from the sponsors and advertisers to the fans, should stop having anything to do with them until he's been fired. Prosecutors need to be asking any women who have ever had any business dealings with them or any sort of association with them or ever been in contact with them to step forward if they've got something to say. They should be soliciting women to step forward at a time like this. But they're not. Ari Emanuel must also be held accountable for hiding at a time like this. What kind of company wants the boss to decide that he's going to go on radio silence at a time like this? When Ari Emanuel was pretending to be outraged about Kanye West, he was so quick to tell everybody that silence is violence. Well, actually, silence is simply silence. What Dana White did is violence. And what Ari Emanuel and the white media are doing is covering for it. And what we have the power to do is to make sure that any time they call themselves mentioning Dana White or Ari Emanuel or UFC, we bring this up. And the next time they get ready to bring a black person in for some regular abuse, we bring this up. We cannot and will not any longer allow the white media to use abusing black people as just another sick form of sport. Good evening, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Endoro Emblem, Salim Muhammad, Iris Johnson, Michael, and Frederica Moore. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you. This past week,